Hello again. I'm always a bit suspicious of catchy 2 or 3 word slogans which indicate support for some political cause. Forward with the people, bread and peace, liberty, fraternity and equality, pro-life, or, the most recent iteration of this theme, anti-racism. The reason I'm a little cautious about this kind of thing is that real life is immensely complicated, and it is seldom possible to sum up anything worthwhile and important in just a couple of words. Very often such slogans or catchphrases are designed to make it impossible to disagree with the sentiments expressed. Take, for example, the pro-life movement. These are people who are opposed to abortion and euthanasia, and they hit upon a brilliant 2-word expression with which it is almost impossible to disagree. After all, we're all pro-life, right? What's the opposite to being pro-life? Being anti-life? Or pro-death? Unless we belong to some weird death cult, then few of us are going to say that we are anti-life. Of course, this is a very neat bit of sophistry on the part of those who started this movement. Ask people if they are in favour of life, and all will reply that they are. Whether you support a prohibition on abortion, though, is rather a different question. The majority of people in Britain are in favour of allowing abortions, but I think it would be absurd to say that most British people are pro-death or anti-life. Most of us find it easy to spot linguistic trickery of this kind, but when it comes to the latest and most fashionable example of this game, nobody likes to point out the deception because of the extraordinary reluctance to expose oneself to the accusation of being soft on racism. Here's how this latest piece of trickery is played. Ask almost anybody in the street the question, are you in favour of racism? And it is a bit like asking if they are in favour of death. You know the answer you'll get in both cases. No, I'm not in favour of racism. No, I'm not in favour of death. Great. If you're not in favour of death, then you must be pro-life, right? Another pro-lifer. Not in favour of racism? Why, then you must be anti-racist, yes? That's one more anti-racist. Of course, being pro-life actually has quite a different meaning from simply being in favour of life. Let me read the dictionary definition of pro-life from the Oxford Dictionary of English, my favourite go-to. Pro-life, opposing abortion and euthanasia. You see, being in favour of life, which we all are, is quite a different thing from being pro-life. And in just the same way, not being in favour of racism is a very different kettle of fish from being an anti-racist. The reason for this should be obvious, but because very few people like to ask awkward questions about racism these days, it is not immediately apparent. Let me explain. The trick here, of course, is that nobody quite likes to ask what racism actually means. It's a bit like the emperor's new clothes. You're expected to know, and no one really wishes to appear stupid or childlike by showing ignorance on the subject. Not only that, but many people honestly do not know that the meaning of racism has changed dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years. So if somebody asks me if I'm in favour of racism, I must first ask what they mean by the word, if they are using it in the old sense of racism. And just let me check the definition here, using once again the Oxford Dictionary of English. Bear with me a moment. This, by the way, is the advantage of actually having books, because online dictionaries are subject to unexpected change. Racism, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against somebody of a different race. Right. According to that definition, I am certainly against it. The idea that a black person should be denied a job because of his skin colour is appalling. If a black person gets the right A levels rather, then he should have an equal opportunity of going to Oxford University, and refusing to rent a flat to somebody based on their race is dreadful. So I am certainly opposed to racism, if that's what you're talking about. There's a second definition, of course, which is the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics, abilities, or qualities specific to that race. Right. This is a little different, and I'm not sure if there is something in this idea. I cannot claim to be utterly opposed to it, but nor am I an uncritical champion of the idea. Even if true, though, I do not think that it provides grounds or should provide grounds for discrimination against certain groups. So far, so good. This kind of thing is what most people mean if you ask them if they are in favour of racism. What many people do not know is that such dictionary definitions have now changed. The American Merriam-Webster dictionary, until 2 years ago, had similar definitions to the ones which I read out just now. However, on the 28th of May 2020, a young black student in the United States sent an email to Merriam-Webster asking them to consider altering the definition to include the idea of racism as entailing systemic oppression and being dependent for its existence upon an imbalance of power. Kennedy Mitchum asked that the dictionary be updated in this way when the next edition was published. A spokesman from Merriam-Webster agreed to consider the matter. Kennedy Mitchum was by no means a lone voice in the wilderness. This particular definition of racism has been widely accepted among left-wingers and academics for several years. Rather than simplifying and making things easier, a definition of racism which includes the necessity for it to be connected in some way with systemic oppression, as in institutionalized racism, is fraught with hazard. For one thing, adopting it in Europe and the United States will have the effect of exculpating members of any minority from a charge of racism. If a black employer refuses to hire Chinese workers because he feels an antipathy to those of East Asian origin, this could not be considered racism, because it's not part of systemic oppression, but rather an individual dislike. In this way, black people, those from the Indian subcontinent, Arabs, and people of East Asian heritage will gain a free pass for expressing detestation of Jews, Hispanics, and anybody else they don't care for. Instinctively, we feel that something might be wrong here. The latest online definition of racism by Merriam-Webster now includes this new concept, saying that racism is the systemic oppression of a racial group to the social, economic, and political advantage of another. At once, we see that in the Western world, racism becomes an exclusively white practice. In both Europe and America, it is by and large white people who are in control of these social, economic, and political systems which may be used for oppression, and so they alone are capable of racism. The definition of racism as simple prejudice or discrimination has now disappeared. For most of us, it is of more than academic interest because we know that prejudice on racial grounds is horribly common in all countries and among every ethnicity, but that it is usually carried out on a haphazard and informal basis, rather than as a means to inflict systemic oppression. Ghanaians sometimes speak disparagingly of Nigerians. Black Caribbeans make unfortunate remarks about Africans, suggesting they are backward and unsophisticated. And it's not uncommon for black people to express antipathy towards Jews, Koreans, or Pakistanis. The list of such racial prejudice or discrimination, to use Merriam-Webster's old definition, is lengthy and depressing. All this has now been wiped clean, and white people alone are to be blamed for any racism which is seen. This, then, is the nature of the problem with asking if somebody is in favour of racism and then if they say they are not, co-opting them to the anti-racist cause. Being anti-racist implies a great deal more than simply rejecting racism. It is a political stance, a particular political stance, which many people like me who reject racial prejudice do not feel inclined to adopt. So, although I'm very sceptical of anti-racism and would not consider myself an anti-racist, that does not mean that I adopt the opposite stance, that I am pro-racism, in favour of racism, any more than the fact that I am not a supporter of the pro-life movement means that I belong to an anti-life movement or support the idea of being pro-death. All this should be so blindingly obvious that it hardly seems necessary to make a video about it, but because no one likes to talk too much in detail about racism and ask questions, it has been necessary.